It was Christmas Eve, and the setting was far from any kind of celebration. I was at the Las Vegas Medical Center, my body exhausted and scarred by the pain of emergency surgery. The white walls of the hospital reflected my loneliness, while my 2-year-old twins Ethan and Emily played in the corner, unaware of the weight of everything that was happening. The sound of my mother coming from the video call cut through the silence like a sharp blade, but it wasn't just the tone of her voice that hurt. It was the indifference in her eyes, a disinterest that tore even more my already wounded heart. "Don't you dare ask us to cancel our plans again. We've had these Elton John tickets for months," she shouted. Those words, which might have been just a meaningless phrase to most, were like a direct blow to my very being. Natasha Wilson, was 33 years old, and I was feeling the weight of a whole life being left behind, as if I were invisible to those who were supposed to support me. And that night, like so many other moments in my life, I was once again the last one to be considered. For as long as I can remember, I have been the forgotten child. My younger sister, Jessica, the golden child, had never done anything wrong in my parents' eyes. Meanwhile, I found myself with a heavy heart, trying to be everything to everyone but being left out, unrecognized. For years I had supported my parents financially, paid their mortgage, believing that this was what families were supposed to do: support each other. But now, when I needed it most, when my life was literally at risk, what I received in return was contempt and words that cut deeper than any physical pain I could feel. "You are becoming a real nuisance and burden, Natasha. We are retired now. We deserve to enjoy our lives without your constant problems," my father said. And those words, they echoed in my soul like a distant but unbearable echo. I, who had done so much for them, now found myself alone, fighting life, death, and pain. And yet what I received in return was more abandonment. But at that moment something inside me was lit. A fire that could not be extinguished. A strength I didn't even know I had. I looked at my children, so small, so fragile, and realized that if something were to happen to me, I didn't want to leave them in the hands of people who saw them as a burden. My life, despite everything, still had a greater purpose. And from that moment on, I decided to cut the poisonous ties that tied me to a past of neglect and pain. I asked Valerie, the nurse who cared for me, to call Olivia, a friend of hers who specialized in childhood trauma. Something inside me knew that I needed a change. I needed to cut the chain that kept me trapped in a cycle of disillusionment. When the call ended, a wave of memories invaded my mind. I remembered the years of struggle, the relentless search for approval, the weight of trying to be good enough for someone who had never truly loved me. But in that moment, I realized that true strength lay in my decision to follow my own path. I no longer needed their approval. Not anymore. What I needed was to give my children the love I had never received, the acceptance I had longed for. Life is not fair, but we can choose how to react. We can choose to rewrite our story, turn the page, and start over. I was starting a new journey. A journey where self-love and courage became my weapons. I was capable of creating a new family, of building a home where respect and love are the foundations. If you identified with my story, if you have also felt the weight of abandonment and disappointment, I want to invite you to reflect. What is your story? What are you willing to change in your life to be truly happy? The journey to self-knowledge and transformation begins now. Don't let past mistakes determine your future. Change is in your hands. Share your story in the comments, and together we will support each other on this journey of transformation. If you want more inspiration and strength to transform your life, subscribe to the channel and come be part of this community of people who, like me, are creating a new beginning. The surgery was successful, but the emotional and physical cost was greater than I expected. 5 days in the hospital, teetering on the edge of consciousness and in pain, were a test. But in the midst of it all, something incredible happened. I found freedom. Freedom not just in the fact that I was alive, but in the decision I made before I was wheeled into the operating room. By canceling the transfers to my parents, by cutting the ties that had kept me trapped in a cycle of dissatisfaction and emotional abuse for so long, I was finally taking the first step toward freedom. When Olivia arrived, she was exactly what Valerie had promised. Professional, kind, and most importantly, connected to my children in ways I never could have imagined. She went beyond being a simple babysitter, becoming a source of support when I needed it most, keeping my twins safe and comfortable while I was at the mercy of recovery. As I recovered, the phone rang nonstop. 27 missed calls and dozens of messages from my parents and Jessica. Most of them were predictable: confusion, anger, and a desperate need for money. But among all the messages, one thing caught my attention. The last one from my father. "You can't just cut us off like that. We're planning a cruise next month and the tickets are non-refundable." Their indifference was almost surreal. This cruise was more important than my life, than the safety of my children. Not a word of concern about how I was doing or how the twins were dealing with their father's absence. Just money. Then Jessica's messages. They were different. He was confused. "Mom and Dad told me you were having a minor procedure. What's going on? Why are you freaking out about money?" That sentence stopped me in my tracks for a moment. They had lied to Jessica, downplayed the gravity of my situation, and I realized the reason for this was obvious. To justify their choice to go to the concert instead of taking care of me and my daughters. But now I had the chance to tell Jessica the truth, unfiltered, unvarnished. My voice still cracking from the medication, I sent the message. And then Jessica replied, fast as lightning. "Oh my God, Natasha. I didn't know it was an emergency. They told me you were being dramatic about a routine checkup. I would have taken care of the twins if I had known. I'm sorry I believed them." It was then and there that I realized Jessica wasn't cruel. She had been raised in an environment where her needs and wants always came first. She just didn't know the truth. And maybe by understanding my parents' true nature, she would begin to see what was really going on. Maybe this would be the beginning of change, not just for me but for her as well. With recovery came decisions. The first was to hire Olivia as a part-time assistant to care for the twins while I recovered. The second, more difficult one was to contact a lawyer to draw up a will, naming a trusted friend as the guardian of my children in case anything happened to me. It definitely wouldn't be my parents. The third step was to block my parents' numbers, leaving only Jessica with limited access. I didn't know if she was sincere, but I needed to give it some time to consider. As for the financial implications of my decision, they were immense. I was sacrificing almost a third of my monthly income to support my parents. But now that the burden was off, I could finally invest in proper care for my children, perhaps even begin to rebuild the emergency fund that had been depleted after James's death. As night fell and I lay in my own bed, feeling the silence around me, a mix of emotions washed over me. There was guilt, yes. That deep sense that maybe I was wrong for putting myself and my children first. There was fear too about what it would be like to manage recovery while caring for two small children. But surprisingly, there was also a new sense of self-respect, something I hadn't felt in a long time. It was then that my phone dinged. It was a text from Jessica. "I just had a huge fight with Mom and Dad about how they treated you. I'm staying at a hotel tonight. Can we talk tomorrow?" I sat there staring at my phone screen, a sense of relief mixed with caution. Maybe after all I wasn't completely alone. Now I knew. My journey to recovery wasn't just about my physical health. It was a journey to rebuild my life, to reclaim my freedom, to take care of myself and my children. And most importantly, it was about understanding that in order to find peace, we sometimes have to make difficult decisions, cut toxic relationships, and rebuild our own stories. If you've ever been in a place where it felt like the world was against you, where you had to choose between your own happiness and the well-being of others, I want you to know that you're not alone. Transformation begins when we decide we deserve better. Share your story in the comments and join me on this journey of self-discovery and empowerment. If you believe you can be stronger than life's challenges, subscribe to the channel and come be part of this community that rises, grows, and transforms every day. The door was closed, but the screams and pleas still echoed through the house. I was exhausted, emotionally drained, but a new power was growing within me, a strength I had never known existed. All my life I had been the forgotten daughter, the one who had always been on the sidelines, waiting for a crumb of love, attention, care. I had sacrificed my own dreams, my health and my well-being, to give to others what they had never given me in return. But now something had changed. I was putting my children first. For the first time I was allowing myself to be the priority. I was learning that I did not need to submit to those who had never known how to value me. I had cut the financial umbilical cord, and with it, cut the ties that bound me to that false sense of obligation. The guilt was heavy, but the peace that was beginning to emerge within me was stronger. Olivia, with her unflappable kindness, was still by my side, helping with the girls, helping me regain not only my body but also my confidence in my own abilities. I was beginning to find myself again, to pick myself up, to see myself again in a way I didn't know I needed. With each passing day I felt stronger, more prepared for whatever came. Jessica, my sister, was beginning to understand the truth she never wanted to see. I saw the struggle in her eyes, the regret, the confusion. But I also saw the opening for change, the possibility of building something new between us, something more real, more genuine. I didn't yet know where it would lead, but I knew I was no longer alone. So that morning when the door opened again, I was ready. Not for another blame game, but to set boundaries, to stand up for what I finally realized was my right: respect. My parents had come with their usual arrogance, trying to manipulate, trying to play with my emotions. But I was different. I was no longer seeking approval. I was seeking peace, and that meant letting go of what was hurting me. I would never treat Ethan and Emily the way you treated me, I said, my voice firm, unwavering. And as the door closed softly, I knew I had taken an important step. A step toward my future. Toward freedom. Now my world was centered on what I could build for my children, for myself. No longer held hostage by the past. From that moment on, I knew that true strength lay in allowing myself to be enough, in giving myself the love I had always sought from others. What about you? Are you ready to cut the chains that bind you to the past? Are you ready to put your own dreams and well-being first? Don't wait any longer. Change starts now, and your story is just beginning. Share your experiences in the comments. I want to know, what are you willing to change today to create the future you deserve? My mother's voice cut through the silence. We made these decisions because you promised to help us. We had to cancel our trips, and now we may lose our house. Her attempts at manipulation were so clear now that I no longer felt trapped in the fog of guilt that had enveloped me for years. When I promised support, I did so with the intention of helping temporarily after their retirement. But somehow, it had become a permanent expectation, an unspoken agreement. Mom, Dad, I'm recovering from major surgery and taking care of 2 small children. This conversation is over, I said firmly before walking away from the door, ignoring their knocks and pleas. Later that day, I received an email from my father, sent to the entire family, describing how I had abandoned them in their time of need, after all they had sacrificed for me. The email conveniently omitted their refusal to care for my children while I was in emergency surgery. Instead, it painted me as an ungrateful daughter who had, for no reason at all, cut ties with the family. What they hadn't anticipated was the backlash this would generate. My cousin Michael, who lived near my parents, responded to the group. Uncle Robert, didn't you buy a new boat last month? And wasn't Aunt Diana showing off a new diamond bracelet at Thanksgiving? Other family members began to chime in and private message me, asking for more information. Even my Aunt Patty, who had always tried to mediate in situations, called me directly after learning the truth. I didn't know about the surgery, she admitted. I was told you were being dramatic about a routine procedure and using it to punish us financially. Meanwhile, Jessica had completely sided with me after seeing our parents' behavior. Together, we crafted a single factual response to the family email. I had emergency surgery with a significant risk of complications. My parents refused to care for my children during this time, as they were more focused on concert tickets. Now, I am focusing on my recovery and caring for my twins without any additional stress. The support I received was overwhelming. Michael's wife brought home home-cooked meals, and a second cousin whom I barely knew offered to babysit part-time free of charge. Jessica began spending weekends with me, getting to know her nephews better and helping them recover. Most surprisingly, Valerie, the nurse who cared for me, connected me with a support group for young widowed parents. The first meeting was via Zoom so I could participate from home, and for the first time since James died, I felt truly understood by people who had been through something similar. Meanwhile, my parents' financial situation was rapidly deteriorating. They were living beyond their means, relying on my monthly contributions to support a lifestyle of travel and luxury shopping. Jessica discovered that they had taken out a second mortgage on their home a year earlier to buy the boat, trusting that I would continue to subsidize their primary mortgage. They lied to all of us, Jessica said, shocked after reviewing their finances at their request. They're not destitute, they're just overspending. They would be fine if they sold the boat and their vacation timeshare. Their increasingly desperate voicemails and texts continued, but with each passing day their influence over me diminished. I was building something real from the ashes of their betrayal. A genuine support network based on mutual care, not obligation. A month after my surgery, an unexpected turn of events occurred. My parents received a foreclosure notice. Jessica called to inform me, her voice a mix of concern and exasperation. They're in a complete panic. The bank has given them 60 days to catch up on their payments or they'll lose their house. So they spent it all on the boat? I asked, bouncing Emily on my knee as Ethan slept, nearly exhausted. Yeah, and they invested the rest in some scheme Dad's golf buddy recommended. They lost almost everything, Jessica sighed. I'm not saying you should help them, Natasha, I just thought you should know. Later that night, I received desperate messages from both parents, now abandoning any pretense of concern for my well-being and openly begging for money. My mother's message was particularly telling. We never thought you'd actually cut us off. We assumed you were just angry and would start sending money again after a week or two. Their assumption that my boundaries weren't real infuriated me. All those years of putting their needs before mine, accepting their mistreatment. They had never truly respected me. Yet somehow my life was blossoming. I was surrounded by a support network that genuinely cared about me and my children. The pain of loss was still there, but now there was room for healing, for building something new and true. I had a new perspective on what it meant to be cared for, not out of obligation or manipulation, but by people who genuinely wanted my well-being. I was creating a home for myself and the twins, not just physically but emotionally and mentally as well. The new house with the backyard meant freedom for the children and an environment where they could grow up healthy and happy. And I, stronger than ever, was finally reconnecting with my true identity, my strengths, and my ability to move forward, no matter who was around me. Over time, the relationships I had lost or left behind began to make sense. The manipulation and guilt I had carried for so many years began to dissipate. What had once seemed like a huge loss now felt like an opportunity for rebirth. I was rising from the dead, more than just surviving. I was now someone who was building a full life based on genuine love and consciously choosing who to be with. Even though I had lost James and made the difficult decision to cut ties with my parents, life was beginning to change in ways I had never imagined. I felt stronger every day, not only because I was overcoming the pain of loss, but because I was learning to build a life that was entirely my own, without the burdens of guilt or other people's expectations. My new home was a radical change from the small, cramped apartment we had lived in before. The kids, now with a backyard to play in, had more freedom, more space to explore, to be themselves without the limitations that had previously surrounded us. This was liberating for me too. Having a real home in a safe, welcoming neighborhood was a feeling I hadn't had in a long time. The side business I had started, creating memorial websites, grew in ways I never imagined. The commissions started coming in, and with them, a new sense of purpose that went beyond survival. What had once seemed like a way to keep myself busy now became a true passion. I was no longer just paying the bills or trying to keep life going. I was creating something meaningful, something that fulfilled me and gave my life new meaning. Olivia continued to help with the twins, but I had reorganized my schedule to be more present for them. I went from being a mom who was torn between work and personal life to being a present mom who lived every moment with Ethan and Emily to the fullest. I allowed myself to be there for them without the burden of responsibilities that I had before. Now our days were lighter, more peaceful, and I could feel that I was being the mother I always wanted to be. Jessica unexpectedly became a real sister to me. Instead of competing for our parents' affection, she supported me, sharing her experiences and helping me better understand what I needed to do to move forward. It was no longer a relationship of resentment or rivalry. Now there was something genuine between us. She was there for me, and that connection became one of the most precious I had. Even Valerie from the hospital, who had previously seemed like a professional, became a true friend. She would come to my house with her children when I needed emotional support the most. I was surrounded by people who genuinely cared about me, who saw me not just as someone grieving, but as someone who was rebuilding her life step by step. I had lost my husband and, with it, many of my old ideas about family and love. However, the life I was creating now was more authentic and true than anything I had experienced before. The weight of guilt and obligation, especially from my parents, had lifted, and I was finally understanding that my happiness and well-being did not depend on pleasing them or living up to their expectations. I was taking control of my life, creating a reality where the love and support I received was based on reciprocity and respect, not manipulation. Looking back, I no longer saw the loss as a burden, but as a catalyst for my transformation. I was no longer the submissive daughter who accepted being mistreated and devalued. I was a strong woman, capable of building a full life for myself and my children. Most importantly, I now knew that true family is the one that supports you, understands you, and is there for you no matter the circumstances. And that, to me, was the most precious thing of all. 6 months after my surgery, an unexpected milestone happened. I received a letter. Not a quick email or text message, but an actual letter, handwritten with pen. For a moment, I considered simply throwing it away. The anger and distrust were strong enough that I didn't even want to look at the contents. But for some reason, something inside me gave in to curiosity and I opened it. The letter was from my mother. And what I read in it was something I had never imagined. A genuine apology. The words were filled with a deep regret, something I couldn't remember seeing before, not even from her. "I've had time to reflect on my behavior," she wrote. "Watching you build a life without our help has forced me to face some painful truths about myself. As a mother, I was jealous of your independence. Your resilience bothered me, and I resented no longer being needed by you as my mother had always been for me. But now I see that you needed me, just not in the way I wanted to be needed. When you asked us to care for the twins during your surgery, you were reaching out. And we failed you completely. I'm so sorry." The letter went on to explain how they had restructured their finances. My father had taken a part-time job at a local hardware store, and they had sold off almost all of their luxury items. For the first time in decades, they were living modestly. There was no request for money, not even a plea for forgiveness, just a sincere acknowledgement of their mistake. When I showed Jessica the letter, she was skeptical. "They've been talking about writing to you for weeks," she told me. "Dad was against it at first, but I think he's starting to see things differently, especially after his heart scare last month." "Heart scare?" I asked, concerned. "Just high blood pressure and chest pains," but he was scared. "He's now on medication and actually following his doctor's orders," Jessica explained. "I think facing mortality has humbled him a bit." I knew I needed time to process my feelings. I wasn't ready to respond to the letter right away. I wondered if what they were doing was genuine remorse or just another attempt at manipulation. Had they really changed, or were they just adapting their strategy? That night, I looked at old family photos, something I hadn't done since I cut ties with my parents. As I looked through the images, I began to see patterns that had previously been hidden from me. My parents had always played the role of the perfect parents, but at the same time, they had always put their own needs ahead of ours. As if they were acting out a role rather than actually living it. That's when I realized that while the past could not be changed, I was finally in a place where I could decide what I wanted for my future. I no longer wanted to continue in a toxic dynamic, but I also knew that forgiveness could be a form of liberation. So, a year after my surgery, I finally agreed to meet my parents. But not at home, but at a quiet cafe near my new home, a neutral location. When they arrived, I barely recognized them. My father seemed smaller, as if the confidence he had always exuded had dissipated. Her posture was more humble, and my mother's designer clothes had been replaced with simple, practical outfits. The twins were with Jessica for the afternoon, and I wasn't really prepared for a family reunion. I didn't know how it would go. We sat in silence, both of us uncomfortable, until my father did something I never imagined. He cried. "I've been a terrible father," he admitted, his voice breaking. "And an even worse grandfather. I don't expect your forgiveness, but I want you to know that I now see how selfish we've been." My mother reached across the table, not quite touching mine but gesturing toward it. "We've been in family therapy for months," she explained. "It was Jessica's idea and we resisted it at first, but it's been transformative. I didn't rush to forgive them or make promises I couldn't keep. Instead, I shared photos of the twins and talked a little about our new life. They listened in silence, without interrupting, without making the conversation about themselves. Perhaps for the first time they truly listened to me. When we parted, my father asked, calmly, if it would be possible to meet his grandchildren someday. I wasn't sure I was ready to open that door again, but for the first time, I felt that perhaps time would be the best ally in finding a new path, whether for me or for them.